Hello and welcome to the CXO Trust Summit. I am Dave Lewis, and it is my pleasure to be able to kick things off here today. So first and foremost, the talk today is called License to Kill Switch, mainly because I have a rather interesting love of James Bond films, but the real crux of this is talking about agentic AI and how that relates to the cloud and the security issues therein. So I've been working in security now for about 31 years. I've had all sorts of different roles. Currently, I'm the global advisory CISO at 1Password, and I'm also a co-owner of a whiskey distillery and a soccer club, but that's a story for another day. While I work at 1Password, I also serve on the advisory boards for Sightline Security, BIOS IO, and Gnostic. It's really an interesting world that we're living in with respects to AI as well as cloud, and it keeps things interesting. So just a quick little background about where I work at 1Password. We've had a history of being a mom and pop shop ostensibly for about 18 and a half years, where we did one product and it did it really, really well. In the last year and a half, we've switched into the enterprise space, and we are looking very heavily as to security for AI and all sorts of different things like that. So it is just one of those things I like to touch on, because a lot of times I have that conversation. People do not realize that we have grown from what we originally started as. So I am Canadian, and I am a hacker by definition, so we tend to look at things a little bit differently here in Canada. Although I do tend to feel like that old man yelling at the cloud most of the time, and a lot of that is because we tend to repeat a lot of the mistakes of the past. We don't tend to learn from our history. So whether or not it is on-premise systems, cloud, AI, we seem to have this repetitious behavior that we are touching on a lot of the same issues over and over again, which ultimately lead to data breaches. And we've seen all sorts, from Petya to SolarWinds to Colonial Pipeline, and so on and so forth, all of the hits. The key here is to understand that I'm not making fun of these organizations. It's just to show that this can quite literally happen to everyone, and anyone for that matter. And the thing we have to be very cognizant of is that from a security perspective, when it comes to the cloud, with AI running on top of cloud systems, we are really accelerating the possibilities where things can and probably will go horribly wrong. The one thing that always seems to come up is the idea that it was an unpredictable event. How could it ever happen on our network? The reality here is that in hindsight, we tend to look back at it and say, oh, yeah, that was something we could have easily fixed. So we want to make sure that we are trying to do all of the heavy lifting before we get to that part, before we get to the blast radius of the high impact. And we want to make sure that when we look back at it, that if it is a major event with huge impact, that it wasn't as simple as just saying, oh yeah, we could have fixed that, but why didn't we? A great example of this is the Mirai botnet. If you're not familiar with this, you have some homework to do. This was a botnet made up of IoT devices that were all strung together across the internet. They were using default credentials, much like this. This is actually a subset of the credentials that were being utilized. And as you can see, root, user, root pass. These were all default credentials hard-coded into these devices. And unfortunately, as a result of this, the attackers were able to build out a botnet using these as well as their own SaaS provider to launch distributed denial of service attacks that were really significant. At the beginning, it was about 1.4 terabits of traffic. Nowadays, well, people like to tell me this is old news, but oh wait, it's still being talked about. So to be very clear, this particular article about the Mirai botnet was just from last January. Let me just zoom in on that for you. January of this calendar year. And there have been stories that have followed on from that. So what we thought we had dealt with, what we thought we had addressed, has continued on. We have to make sure that when we address these problems, they actually get fixed. Otherwise, it's all on fire. Passwords are one of those things where I just sort of scratch my head. I've always looked at a password as very much analogous to a house key, and I use this example over and over again when I give talks. The idea here is when you leave your house to go to work, go to school, whatever it happens to be, you lock your door so you can protect your stuff. The thing is, if you lose that key, there is no way for the house to know that the person who finds it isn't you. And these sort of credentials that we're utilizing are of limited utility from a security perspective. So they are a control, but I would, not say a security control. And that's why we need tools in place to better secure organizations and making sure that, you can actually validate who is actually accessing your environment. because the attackers know this and they prey on this. This is just one story as an example of many out there. This particular group called Fin9 was going after various different sites to break into them using, compromised credentials. And they were good for $71 million in losses. This was a team of 4 people. Why it matters now? Well, AI is everywhere, from searching to scams to all sorts of different things. And to be clear, AI has so much potential. There's so many amazing things about it, but we're moving at such a fast pace that when things can and will go wrong, it's going to be rather gruesome. And threat actors now have their own co-pilots. We have to be very cognizant of that and understand that at the core of any security program, we have to realize it's the human element that is the ultimate root of any security program. The attackers know this. We have to know this as well, because when things can and will go wrong, this is going to be the issue. And it leads to data breaches. And there's been all sorts of them. This is from informationisbeautiful.net. I use this over and over again. They update this on a pretty regular basis. It's kind of staggering, the size of these data breaches. When you look back to 2012, where the biggest data breach at that point in time was about 6.9 million records. Now we're dealing with orders of magnitude of billions of records. It's not getting better. So when we're accelerating with these new technologies, we have to realize that we haven't actually fixed all of the core fundamentals that we should have addressed in the first place. Ransomware, same sort of animal. It keeps soldiering on. And as we look at this, the attackers have changed their strategy over time. If you look over on the far right side of the column in 2023, which is the most recent data that they had for this, the smaller bubble indicates the smaller size of the organization. Now, people are saying, oh, well, they're not going after major enterprises anymore. Well, this is where the accident happens, because those smaller bubbles have contracts with larger organizations, and the attackers realize this, and they're trying to pivot through the smaller organizations to get into the bigger ones. Things we have to look at are things like prompt injection. The LLMs are everywhere at this point. ChatGPT really was a catalytic event for, people in the wider audience. Like, AI has been around since 1954. This is not new, but it has absolutely exploded in the last few years. We have to figure out how we can design for zero trust so that we are dealing with external contents as adversarial, so inputs and outputs are being filtered. Sound familiar? SQL injection. Same sort of principle applies, and yet we're still seeing these issues crop up. If you're familiar with Echo Leak, that's a great example. Look that up at Echo Leak, one word. That was an amazing proof of concept attack where they were able to send an email to a controlled subject and say, okay, here's the email. The person read it. It was just a benign email, but in the bottom half of it, it was text in white. So the white font was not visible to the human user, but it was readable by the Copilot agent, which executed the commands and then erased any trace of the interaction as per the instruction set that it received. To be fair, Microsoft fixed this before it ever got to the news, so that was a good thing. The fact that it was even possible, a little bit disturbing. So we have to look at the threat map today. We're dealing with prompt injection, data exfiltration. Prompt leakage is another big problem, and poisoning of data. So when we used to talk about it, we talk about the early days where attackers would break into a site and change the front page and say, greets to all my friends. That's really fallen long by the wayside at this point. And now the attackers know that they can get your data. They can manipulate your data. And then we look at the classic risks that are amplified, like deep fakes and voice clonings, your typical scams, and so on and so forth. All of these things that were in the past are still here today. They're just a lot easier to do. The barrier for entry for an attacker or a criminal has lowered so much that I can run an attack or a deep fake right off of my cell phone. Hugging Face is an example of just one of the many things that are out there where, the attackers were able to gain access, and we really had to treat package registries and rotate tokens and least privilege as part of the equation. So when we're dealing with AI, we have to look at it from the perspective of the way we used to do things or should have been doing things in the early days, then the way we should have been doing things in cloud, and in a lot of cases we were, the same principles continue to apply. We always have the fun of the deep fake of the CEO calling. I experienced this with one company in Europe where they had a CEO went out to the parking lot. He was about to drive off for vacation, received a call from him ostensibly, and he came back into the office because he forgot something. And he got to sit in there and listen to the entire call and participated in it. And it was absolutely staggering because he was shocked how much it sounded like him. This is nothing new at this point, but In the early days when that particular one happened, it was pretty rare. Now it is a trivial exercise for the attackers. Defenders use AI for anomaly detection, automation, and prediction. Attackers also use it. They're using it for phishing, deepfakes, things like that. Adaptive malware, like we saw with Worm GPT. There's also Fraud GPT and various other platforms like that. It really is an arms race between human ingenuity and machine learning when we get down to it, and we have to really make sure that we're getting ahead of things as fast as we can. When we're dealing with AI in the security stack, we have behavioral analytics, threat intel enrichment, which is amazing that you can use it for that, automated triage and response. These are all fantastic pieces of the puzzle. Now, when we're using machine learning from an offensive perspective, using an LLM to generate a phishing campaign is a trivial exercise. I've done this as a proof of concept. It was so dirt simple. It took me all of about 5 minutes, and that's only because I got it to try different versions. AI chatbots, rather, are harvesting data when you log into their sites or for various vendors and things like that. They're collecting all that information to train their models. The attackers know this as well, and they're trying to capture that data too. Deepfake videos as well. It goes on and on. Now, social engineering is a big piece of this for the attackers. Curiosity, urgency, and the rest of it. Those are key vectors. And the classic cons really haven't gone away, and they just have new delivery systems fundamentally. We also have to look at it when machines lie. We've heard all sorts of different stories about, various platforms trying to protect themselves by creating all sorts of erroneous information or threatening users. But the reality is, these things are written by humans and they will be fallible. They will make mistakes. And when the attackers are using this, they can use it for building out phishing avatars at scale for fake identities and mimicking tone to gain trust. And that's just it. It is a fundamental attack on trust. And when we're dealing with AIs, we have to look at it from the perspective of the types of identities that we're dealing with, because the attackers are using it for fraud and the rest of it. And this is not to say that AI is bad. It's just we have to be very clear that it's like a hammer. You can use it to build a house, or you can bash somebody about the head and neck. It's not the tool's fault, it's how it's being utilized. So we have to make sure that we have protections in place to deal with these sort of things. AI hallucinations are another thing that keeps coming up, and especially with LLMs, it will invent falsehoods, and that's not because it's being malicious. It's just from a mathematical perspective, it's an inevitability. There's been a few research papers on that recently. And the attackers can then use these sort of hallucinations to build out disinformation campaigns, which unfortunately are rather pervasive, especially on social media these days. Regulation is another thing that is coming up over and over again, where countries around the world are rolling out their bits of legislation, from the EOAI Act, legislation in Canada, United Arab Emirates, and so on. These are all bits of legislation that are being pushed out to try and match the speed of AI, and unfortunately they're falling short. The one thing that does seem to fall short across the board is dealing with ethics and accountability, and this is something that we have to be very cognizant of, because again, we're going back to the human element. With all of these AI platforms being run across cloud instantiations, we really have to make sure that we're getting ahead of this before bad things can and will happen. Human-centered, that's the fundamental piece. Zero trust, we have to look at it as risk reduction. And how do we look at that with not only the human, the cloud, and AI? We have to figure out how we're going to make this work from that perspective for usability and identity, as well as figuring out how we can get humans and machines to work together, because we don't want fully autonomous systems to completely take over the narrative. From your defensive playbook, you have to look at continuous awareness training, trusting but verifying all of your sources. If you're on a meeting and something doesn't look entirely right, it used to be as simple as getting somebody to wave their hand in front of their face and you would see rippling around the picture if it was a deep fake. Unfortunately, just under 6 months ago, technology was released that would remove all of that, so that even if you got somebody to put their hand in front of their face like that, you wouldn't be able to tell definitively that it was a fake video. These are really, really troubling times, so we have to figure out new ways to protect against that, and strong identity access management foundations are going to really help. Assume compromise. That's the easiest way to start from there. Figure out how you can empower people within your organization. Don't punish them. Don't vilify the users. Security really is an enabler of trust, and we want to make sure that we're clear about that. During the pandemic, security really had a great moment where we were able to demonstrate we were there to empower organizations to operate safely and securely when they had to suddenly be distributed across the planet and out of the office. we have to understand that AI really just changes tactics, not the targets. All the targets are still remain the same, whether it's the human, whether it's cloud instantiations, what have you. That part hasn't gone away. And we have to build up the awareness and the empathy that we're dealing with the users so they understand automation. There's a lot of people out there that are actually very concerned about artificial intelligence because some organizations out there are using that as an excuse to lay off people. And there are certain companies out there that have done that and realized that they made a critical error, and they are backtracking on that. Again, going back to that human element, we have to make sure that we're building empathy and with the organizations that we're dealing with, and making sure that we're informing the humans and understanding that responsible AI equals resilience fundamentally. You got to stay curious and stay critical. Follow reputable sources and verify your information. Don't just accept whatever an LLM spits out. Double check everything as an example. And when you're receiving something, whether it's a video, an email, whatever it happens to be, how do you know it is really from that user? And these are the kind of things you have to have critical thinking. You have to be your own best line of first defense. Because when you're looking at a corporate AI strategy, when organizations are uploading all of their information to the cloud so the LLM can process it, oh, wait, we don't have control of that data anymore. And do you have good governance in place to protect this? And this is a real problem. There's an organization that is well documented, but I won't name them. They had put all of their week of corporate meetings into an LLM to distill them down into a report that they could share internally. Business case, sound, made sense. Unfortunately, it was a free iteration of an LLM, and all of that data was immediately accessible by anybody who knew how to ask the right questions. Agentic AI really is a different animal. And why does that matter from a credential management perspective? So we have to, differentiate between the two. And one of the things that I find a lot is there's a collision here where people look at generative AI and agentic AI in the same bucket, and this really is a different animal. Generative AI, you're creating the content, be it video, images, whatever it happens to be. Agentic AI really is about the ability to make autonomous decisions on your behalf. You find me a restaurant location, all the rest of it, build me out a report. And we have to understand that those three key features of agentic AI are autonomy, adaptability, and goal orientation. And when we're looking at this, there's 5 levels of agentic AI. And the first level being as simple as, lane assist when you're driving is a great example, with level 5 being akin to a fully autonomous car. The key here is that the technology really doesn't exist at this point, but this could change in a week, in a month, in a year, where that will happen. But I think we can only get to about semi-autonomous at this point. And that's the good piece of the puzzle because we still want to have that human in the loop. Broader access really does mean increased risk because all of these agentic systems need access to different things, APIs, services, all the rest of it, and they're all going to need credentials to do that. So how are you going to manage that? AI really is built to just work. Like we've heard this story before. We have to look at least privilege. We have to look at zero trust, segmentation of duties, all those sort of things, because in a lot of cases, security, again, is an afterthought. And this should have been, upfront and dealt with before anything got out of the, into the wild. And like, if we look back to the advent of the internet, security wasn't a factor. It was never considered at the time. And I remember my old professor, Scott Bradner, he was one, his name is on all the original RFCs, or quite a lot of them. And I asked him, I said, was security ever taken into account? And he said, no, fundamentally, we just wanted to make it work. Understandable, but we had to deal with security later on. Agentic AI risks, stolen credentials, wider latitude within an organization. Unfortunately, these are things that we have to be very aware of. And AI agents can create targeted phishing attacks like we were talking about earlier, and they can mess with verification systems. So you have to figure out how is this going to work in a way that is going to be able to better secure your environment without falling victim to these types of systems. Great way to look at it. Secure credential management, AI security governance, zero trust framework that is AI friendly, because we have to make allotments for that nuance that things are different. AI audit and explainability, like you have to be able to explain why an AI system did what it did, because you can't send an AI to jail. Somebody has to be responsible. Supply chain security, that's a key piece of the puzzle. How are your model zoos being accessed? Are they shared ones? Things like that. And compliance. We have to look at this because we have to deal with the access trust gap. The old school version of everybody being in the office and using, corporate assets really has fallen by the wayside. Cloud was the real shifting point where people went, oh, wait, I can be anywhere as long as I have an internet connection. So you have the BYOD piece, you have the unmanaged apps and things to that effect. And the attack surface really has spread. And when we factor in AI and unsanctioned AI products as well, it really ups the risk level. Now, when we're talking about risk level, we have to look at things like black swan events. Now, Nassim Taleb wrote this amazing book about the highly improbable. And the idea here was when we're dealing with these impacts, he was doing it from a perspective of the stock market. But you can directly apply this to cybersecurity as well. And when we're looking at these events that were quote unquote unpredictable, nobody saw them coming, major impact, but in hindsight, everything was fine. Well, this is the kind of thing that we have to address. And when we're dealing with AI, we can recognize early on that problems can and will happen. We just have to make sure that we do the hard work up front. Because unfortunately, security people tend to follow our own rules. We need to be better at communicating to the wider audience. We got to stop being that flaming sword of justice where the answer is always no. So at one point, I was working at one company years ago, and from an access perspective, this was something that came up. We went through and did an assessment of all the super user status in the environment and who still had access that was no longer part of the organization. So as we went through there, we found there was 10 accounts that still had root access to systems in the environment. And this was a company I worked at years ago. The problem was one of those accounts had been active in the last 2 years, but that individual had actually been deceased for 5. So ultimately, we were able to track it down and find out that that particular access was just to check a cron job, and somebody had it stuck to their monitor. I can't even make this stuff up. It's such a cliche, but that was the truth of it. The problem is luck is not a strategy. We want to make sure that when we're securing our environments, be it on-prem, in the cloud, artificial intelligence, that we are doing the core fundamentals well. Improving password management, multi-factor authentication, passwordless, role of password managers as well. We have to look at different approaches for data protection. When we're looking at it from the perspective of artificial intelligence, the speed and the amount of data involved, we have to really figure out how we can create resilience within our organizations. We have to look at how we can build anti-fragile systems that can take a hit and keep on going. And this is another concept that Nassim Taleb talked about in his other book called Anti-Fragility. And we have to figure out how do we do continuous improvement and learning from our failures, because at the rate of change that we're seeing with artificial intelligence, it's only a matter of time before the mistakes start happening. And this is not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's just a practical reality. As long as you have humans touching keyboards, the whoops factor is coming for us all. So we have to be prepared. We have to look at how we can go and deal with a data breach when it does happen. And we've already seen different instances of that, and there will be more. We have to look at unsanctioned IT as well as unsanctioned AI. A lot of times people do it for speed of convenience in their organization, or there's a perceived inadequacy that they see that they don't have the ability to have support from their IT organizations. Because a lot of times they're being told that they have to innovate and experiment and go faster than anyone else. Building the airplane when it's already in flight, that sort of concept. So we have to make sure that they understand what is available and why things aren't available to avoid exposing, your organization to undue risk. And there's all sorts of that. We have to look at the risks of the data security. How is that data being used? Is it being used with production data to run shadow IT systems or unsanctioned IT systems? This is a question you have to ask. What happens if that data goes out the window? What happens if you're front afoul of compliance? There could be massive fines. GDPR is just one of many examples. And what's the bottom line? How much money is it going to cost you if your data goes out the front door? There was one organization not too long ago where they were using vibe coding to try and build something, and unfortunately the AI deleted all of the production databases and it was not recoverable. These are the kind of things that sound like urban legend, but they keep popping up. So we really have to figure out a way to get ahead of this, because we look back to the old idea of the beige desktop running mission critical code in the data center. Now it is AI systems everywhere. And they are cropping up at such an exponential rate that it's absolutely very difficult to keep ahead of that. Part of my team at 1Password, we do a lot of AI research, and there's so many of these different products that keep popping up. Look at the different types of case studies that can come, like Database Firm back in 2021, another one, a system in 2023 that was a misconfigured cloud environment, and another one where they just didn't see that they had to inform 539 million users that their data was exposed. These are all with older cloud issues at the time, but now take that and flash forward into an artificial intelligence realm. We have to understand that the bad things are going to continue to happen. We have to look at it. How are we going to deal with this? We have to look at zero trust as it pertains to artificial intelligence. We have to look at microsegmentation. We have to look at extended access management. And also we have to contend with the rise of cyber insurance. Cyber insurance really doesn't make you whole again. It helps deal with the investigation and trying to get to the root of what happened, but it will not make you whole again. And when you look at the potential magnitude of artificial environments within a cloud instantiation, it could get really ugly very quickly. We have to have that 10th person principle within our organizations. If 9 people say the cloud is secure, it's the job of the 10th person to say, no, it's not. And here's why. That way, we're not going to be all marching in lockstep with rose-colored glasses. We don't want to check the boxes. We want to understand that the road to hell is literally paved with good intentions. So be able to question it and really tackle the tough problems. Extended access management is a great way to look at this. Enhancing the security, dealing with regulatory compliance, protection of your data, operational efficiencies, and audit and monitoring so you can explain what did happen and why the AI system used that particular credential and who else had access to it. We've got to figure out how we prepare for the future because guess what? It's already here. We have to look at different things. Like, for example, I did a talk with Rich Mogul back in Ireland last year, where we talked about how dealing with black swan events. And one of the things he brought up was a system called the incident command system with how to deal with large events of unpredictable nature. And this was really an interesting exercise to go through. And I recommend digging into that some more. Design, governance, and response. You have to put in the guardrails to make sure you're securing your environment. Here's a 30-day action plan. A baseline of your AI and SaaS usage, disable auto actions, ship input and output filtering, stand up an allow list, and do your tabletops in case an AI incident does eventually crop up. We got to tackle these problems before they grow because they will grow. So we want to make sure we're getting ahead of that. Things are going to change. We got to adapt. I want to thank everyone for your time today. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And feel free to sign up for the Chasing Entry podcast, which I'm a host. Like and subscribe, all that sort of fun stuff. Couldn't resist. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. If you want, drop me a line at dave.lewis@onepassword.com. And it has been my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for your time.